Yeah, well, let's dig in. Hello, everybody. I'm David Cooks, and I tell you what, we know that paralysis can take on many forms. It can be physical like mine, or it can be psychological. You put your mind to. And what we try to do is feature stories that go from difficult places to fulfilling purpose. What seems impossible can be done by you. He is an author of 2 fantastic books. Phil discusses difficult things. It may knock you down, but don't let it stop you. He also deals with healing racial trauma and fostering the ethics of racial solidarity. Got so much to give, a lot of life to live. You must go from paralysis to purpose. Get your pen and paper out. Yeah, I'm taking notes. Paralysis to purpose. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. I'm your host, David Cooks, and I love this because I get to speak with some of the most intriguing and inspiring people on the planet. Today is no exception, but before I tell you who it is, I need for you to like this podcast, share this podcast, leave us a 5-star review. If you don't like this podcast, leave us a 5-star review. Either way, I'm good. I am so excited. Our guest today is a pastor. He's an author. He's a speaker. He's a documentary filmmaker, podcast host, poet, diversity and inclusion consultant. He is a PhD candidate. You hear what I said? I want to call him doctor, but I don't think it's quite done yet. A PhD candidate at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's a Pennell Center for Black Church Studies Fellow. As an emerging ethicist and theologian, his research integrates Black church theology and praxis, a theology of justice. Some may call that liberation theology. He also deals with healing racial trauma and fostering the ethics of racial solidarity. He is an author of 2 fantastic books. Now, I'm telling you right now, both of these books, you're going to be sitting there. I got to keep reading. Engaging, thought-provoking. There's critical analysis. One is a little more academic than the other. Really good books. I'm just telling you, get his books. The first book is called Open Wounds, a story of racial tragedy, trauma, and redemption. And his most recent book is called The Prophetic Lens, the Camera and Black Moral Agency, from Martin Luther King to Darnella Frazier. You guys can't see this, but I got all kind of notes and stickies all over his book. It's outstanding. He is also the founder and executive director of Racial Solidarity Project based out of Pasadena, California. He is a former Division I basketball player, went to HBCU, North Carolina A&T. Got to make sure I put that out there because he'll let me know. And he also has been a guest chaplain for several colleges and professional sports teams. I'll cut it off right there because I could use a whole podcast to talk about his bio, but I'm not going to do that. I am so excited today to have Phil Allen Jr. here with us on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. Phil, thank you for being here, man.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for sharing those words, those kind words about the book and all that stuff. Ready to have a conversation, man.
Yeah, here we go. Hey, I'm going to just let the listeners know in advance. Phil discusses difficult things. He discusses racism and social justice issues and things like that. And it's a part of who he is. And I want to talk about that as part of what he does. The one thing I will say about him in his writings that I found a little bit different, there's a sense of redemption in what he does. Feel a sense of blame or accusation, but it's more of a conversation, an unveiling of things that can create conversation that allows for redemption to take place. So there were things that stirred me. I was like, man, I didn't think about that. Oh, I didn't see it that way. And that's really what I think part of what he does. We're going to start off. I believe that your story, everybody's story, is the most powerful thing that they have. And whatever that story is, they need to tell that story because it's going to impact somebody's life, even if it's just the one person that is assigned to you. Phil, in the book, Open Wounds, it's the story, it's your story. It's your family story. Let's just go back to 1953. And the reason I want to put that date out there is I often talk to peers of mine, my white peers, and I tell them that when I was born, it was the first year that my mom and dad could legally vote. And they're taken aback, like, that wasn't that long ago. And for those of you who see me, I'm closer to 60 than I am 30, but I probably look 35. And that gives you a context of how recent some of these things are that we think have just disappeared because there's been a change in the law and those kind of things. With that being the context, take us back to 1953 and just share with us about your story, why you wrote the book, and some of the things that you want our audience to know about that.
1953 was the year that my grandfather, Nate Allen, a Navy veteran, served in World War II. He was shot and killed. I usually use the term by the hands of racism. He was killed by the hands of racism, or I could say white supremacy. My father was 2 years old. He had 2 older siblings and 1 younger sibling. And my grandmother ended up being a single parent of 4 kids. I never knew anything about the incident. I never knew anything about my grandfather. No one in the house ever talked about him. All I knew was his athletic exploits. He was a phenomenal athlete, a great swimmer. My mom's mother knew him as well. And she said he was like a big brother to her. So he was my dad's father, but on my mom's side, a small town, so everyone knew each other. But I just knew he was like this protective big brother for her, others. But the part that got me was I knew nothing about him. I didn't know how he looked until 2015. Never saw a picture of him. Grandmother never talked about him. Nothing until about 2015. I remember asking her, Grandma, can you tell me about my grandfather? How did he die? Who was he? And there was a visceral reaction. You could see it in her body, her posture, her facial expression, her countenance. And she said, leave me alone with that. Don't leave me alone with that. We're talking 60 years later. And she still couldn't bring herself to even have a conversation about it. So I let it go. And then a few years later, 2015, I had the nerve, the courage to ask her again. And she told me how my grandfather was killed, that her father, my great-grandfather, because on his death certificate, let me say this, on his death certificate, it says accidental drowning. And she told me that her father went to see the body and he had a bullet hole in the back of his head, at the base of his head, top of his neck. So he was shot and killed. And so there's this lie that's on my grandfather's death certificate that will forever dishonor this Navy veteran. And for me, the biggest motivation to tell this story was to honor his name, to tell the truth around his situation so that that lie is not what we remember him by. Because there are people his age to this day, they assume he died of an accident. He fell off the boat, like they said. They have no idea that he was killed to this day. I've had conversations with people my grandmother's age. My grandmother's passed away now, but they're in their early 90s. They find out who I am and, oh, you're Nate Allen's grandson, Philip Allen's son, Rebecca's grandson. And when that comes up, they think he died of an accident, but so they didn't even know that he was killed.
Let's talk about the power of the narrative, because what I think people really don't understand is that whatever the people in authority said back then, that was it. There was no negotiation. There was no research. There was no asking questions. And if someone did, it was hushed away, regardless of if it was a black or white or whomever. I remember my mom is the youngest of 18 children. And yeah, He's whoa. And you grew up in Georgetown, South Carolina. My mom grew up in Forest, Mississippi, which is a rural southern town. And I remember in the 1990s, she called and said, "Hey, our brother is alive." And I'm like, "What brother are you talking about?" Because I knew of all the siblings that were around, but I never heard about her oldest brother, Sam. And he had been accused of some sort of altercation. We still can't get you never get the real stuff with a white man in Mississippi. And so he fled, they thought, to New York. And eventually they found that he was alive and living and doing well in Sumter, South Carolina. Wow. And so she and her living siblings went down and met with him and all of that. I never got to meet him because he passed eventually before I could. But again, one of those things that was unknown, it wasn't talked about. And you talk about the trauma that is unaddressed, the wound that is unaddressed. Talk about that a lot in your book. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because when I began to read that, and my mom is still living, she's 81, and I was like, I might need to ask her some more questions because I know that we're Choctaw Indian and trying to find out more about that as well. But they didn't talk about a lot of things back then. They were trying to survive.
Yes.
They were trying to live. And all of those things that they kept inside, the pain and the trauma. I honor my parents all the time anyway, but coming from Atlanta and Forest, Mississippi during that time and having them be like the best parents I've ever seen in the world is amazing to me because they saw things that would traumatize people. I'm sure they were in trauma. Can you talk about that as part of your journey and stuff that you begin to uncover?
Absolutely. So I started putting language to this in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, understanding trauma as this event, this happening in our lives that is too overwhelming for comprehension. And I think that's the key part of understanding trauma, because nowadays we throw that word around. Anything that bothers us, makes us uncomfortable is trauma. And that's not the case. It's overwhelming for the nervous system, for the body, for the mind, and it leaves a wound. And then we have these, in our minds, our consciousness, we have these memory capsules, they call it. Whether you smell, you can have a positive or negative. You smell a certain perfume and you remember someone who wore that perfume. You hear a certain song and it brings a pleasant memory. The same thing can be true for trauma, that a sound, a place, a smell, a voice can trigger the nervous system because that is housed there. And so if we don't have skills to be able to self-regulate, and it's not that it's going to go away. It's not something you just tough it out and it just goes away. It's there, but it doesn't mean that we have to be hindered by it at all. You can still have the skills to treat, to manage, to self-regulate when you're triggered. My grandmother didn't have that. Your mom and dad probably didn't have that. They had to survive, as you said, which shows the resiliency, but also how unfair it was that they didn't have the outlet to metabolize that trauma, talk about it, to release it. So the grandmother I knew, her brothers in my interviewing them said she was different after that event. She was never the same after that event. So the only grandmother I know is a traumatized grandmother. You could see it in her posture, her body language, her facial expression. She was a tough woman, sometimes hard to be around because she was always complaining and fussing. That was the thing we always say, Grandma, stop fussing. But we didn't realize that came from a place, unaddressed, unattended to trauma. She had to put her head down. She went back to school. I think she got her master's, became an educator. So who absorbs that? Her kids. So my father, he didn't find out how his father was killed until he was 9. And my grandmother said about him, when he found out, she said at 9, how his father died, he was an angry kid ever since. He was an angry person ever since then. So the only father I know, I don't know the pre-9-year-old dad. I only know the one who gets this information that also can be traumatizing, because now at 9 years old, he has to process this. That's overwhelming. I told him recently, not recently, but maybe in the last 5 years or so, I said, do you think you've been grieving your father's death all your life? And he said, well, I never knew my dad. And I said, that's my point. So his coping mechanism was substance abuse, domestic violence, but most of his life, substance abuse. Now he's sober today. For the last 4 years or so, he's been sober. And I think the documentary that I made around this was part of what brought healing, because it gave him a place to metabolize, to talk about his dad, to learn about it. I know more about his dad than he does from my research.
I was going to say, like, you didn't know your grandmother and you didn't know your father. I mean,
I knew my grandmother. No, you're right. You
knew them, but you didn't know who they were.
You're right.
Because you didn't get to see the untraumatized version of their humanity.
Yeah.
You got to see it through that fractured lens. And this is what I mean about when you look at the documentary, you read the books, you begin to really have a different kind of compassion than I'm speaking for me, than I had before. I understood. I know what it means to be Black and to have issues and to my heritage and all of that.
Yep.
But not until I got to live your experience. Your experience, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know, impacted your relationship with your dad. And you had to work through all of those things. And I never really gave credence to the generational aspect of injustice. You're a generation removed, and it didn't happen to me, but I could feel that in my soul and was like, oh my God, let me pray for their family. I wonder how everybody else is doing. You start to think that way. When you reconcile, there's a couple of things I want to touch, because I know you reconcile with your dad. You mentioned this thing about racism is a spirit. And I want you to talk about that in the context of, while your mother was carrying you, your father, even though he had substance abuse and other things, he had enough something in him to pray over you, a particular prayer, while you were in your mother's womb. Could you talk about that? Because I think that understanding that there's a spirit behind hatred and injustice that needs to be attacked and dealt with. And then what your father did to help break that generational thing.
Yeah, I think that as a Christian, I am a more charismatic background in my training. I believe in the spiritual realm. I didn't come to faith because of doctrine, a sermon. I didn't grow in my faith because of that. I grew in understanding, but I believe in God. I believe in Jesus because of supernatural encounters. So you can take the Bible away. If you took every Bible away, you would not take my faith, because my faith was a direct result of an encounters I've had.
Let's talk. I'm not going to let you get past that, because you hear a lot about now faith over fear, and everybody talks about all that. But the object of your faith is important. You had supernatural experiences that exposed you to the power of God so that you could believe in his power. And therefore, like you said, if you never saw scripture or a church building, you had an experience and a word that you could move on.
Yep. I read something where Dr. King said, he wrote, where he believed God was real. He was convinced of the reality of God because of his suffering, not because of his education, not because of church services, because of his suffering. So there was an encounter in that. There's a spiritual encounter there that convinced him of the reality of God. So for me, I understand that while there is human agency, for sure, this doesn't absolve anyone from their responsibilities. But I do believe that there is, just as we believe that there is power, God's power attached to certain things, or we say the love of God is in this person, we also know that there's some evil dynamics going on too. And so when my father, I didn't know this until I did the film and was talking to my dad, actually right before I wrote the book. As I was writing the book, he told me, he said, Phil, I prayed for you, because he knew about the rage inside of him. He played football. Both of his older brothers played professional football. One was a Heisman candidate in 1971. The other one played in the Super Bowl for the Minnesota Vikings. But he was actually considered the best of all three and was a small college All-American. But he could never really get the temper down to stay in a game. Like, he was a hardhead.
Wow.
He knew that was in him. And he said he had enough of the seeds of my grandmother, my grandparents and great-grandparents, taking them to church. We grew up in the church. Those seeds, he knew enough, may not have been to get him sober at that time, but he knew enough to pray over his son in my mother's womb. So there's a cover. I always felt like there was this grace, there was this covering, there was something that God was doing. I should be dead at a car accident at 16. There's no way I should have survived that car accident. So when he told me that, I understood that there was a covering so that I would not take on a generational break, that I wouldn't take on that degree of trauma and rage that my grandmother had, that he had, his siblings had, that there would be enough grace for me to embody redemption. So the work that I do, the fact that I can do the work that I do for racial solidarity, and I'm not talking about racial unity, I'm talking about real solidarity. We in this together. We're going to fight injustice, but we also going to build community together. That type of work. The fact that I can even do that and not have the rage that my father and grandmother have learning about my grandfather, that is redemption in and of itself.
Wow.
The fact that I can be in white evangelical spaces like I was when I planted my church, when I was a young adult pastor at a mega church out here in California, the fact that I could be that, see these folks as family and younger brothers and sisters and mentors, and I could be in that space and not carry that stuff. There's something about my father's prayer that broke that enough for me to embody the redemptive work. I look at my siblings and cousins, how well they're doing, and what happened in 1953, the grace of God is still upon my family. So that's what I mean by redemption, is we are embodying it. We are living it.
Wow. I was going to ask you, when did you know that this is what you were supposed to do? Because as just talking to you, and we hadn't met before now, it is clear to me that you are fulfilling God's purpose for your life. Don't even try to do anything else, because you're going to be miserable. You may have tried, but don't try anything else. When did you first get this inkling about, I call it a dual, it's not a dual calling. It's one calling that is comprehensive. It's a calling to win souls and a calling to heal souls. And it's all part of the same gospel. When did you know that this is what you were supposed to do?
Suffering. A few years ago, I was in a evangelical white conservative church as a young adult pastor and was going through a divorce. And we weren't even separated yet. And I started to see how they were handling my divorce. I hadn't filed any papers. I was still fighting for my marriage. We weren't even separated yet. But whatever was being said on her end, they had already began to position themselves to protect their image as a church and to squeeze me out. And it was punitive rather than pastoral. I felt alone. So I resigned. And then when I left, I felt like I looked back and saw no one really communicated with me. No one contacted me. They responded to my situation very differently than other pastors. And I was the only Black pastor left on that staff. And it was no more than 3 at one point. I was the only one left. And I saw how differently they responded to me versus others who had gone through a similar situation. They handled them pastorally. Mine was punitively. And it made me look back at my 7 years and all the microaggressions, the comments, the condescending remarks. People would come to me and say, I'm praying for you, Pastor, because everybody here don't want you to succeed. It was very subtle, but it was racism, like just gnawing at me. Mm. And that's when I began to really consider, but it didn't hit me for sure until I shared my grandfather's story. And I think I talk about it in the introduction of the book, Open Wounds. I shared his story in a class here at Fuller when I was working on my master's, Ethics and Theology of Martin Luther King. To see the response of my classmates. I'd never seen white people shed tears and show grief for Black suffering. I'd never seen it. That's when it hit. And I said, I got to tell this story. And the more I engaged, the more I realized the passion. Now, I do spoken word poetry. I used to write about Blackness in my poetry before I became a Christian. I used to write about it. I was a Christian, but I wasn't serious about my faith at the time. I used to write about it and talk about it. But I became a Christian. I stopped. I didn't think it was any place for it. But once I was able to look back at that experience and see, whoa, wait a minute, that's what I was dealing with. And why aren't we talking about it? And then you start to see the systemic. You start to see the structural. It's not just about bigotry and what someone said to me and did to me. It's about the stuff that's built into the culture, built into the narrative, the language, the media, the laws and policies, healthcare disparities, education disparities, criminal justice, policing, all these things. And it's, whoa, I'm all in now. But I also want to do it in a way that I want to get justice, but I want a transformed community. So this is where Dr. King's beloved community idea comes in. It's very idealistic, but the work is not to accomplish it. The work is to always move towards it. That's the work.
Transformation is the litmus test for the work that you do.
Yes.
Because people can be emotionally moved.
Yeah.
They can, and we'll talk about that in the second half of the podcast, shortly after the George Floyd murder. All of a sudden, I start seeing all these Black people in commercials and on all these different things. And recently, I'm like, where everybody go? I don't see that anymore. I don't see that anymore. I want to take a break and then come back and jump into the prophetic lens. But before we do that, you had a couple statements in your book about how wounds can redirect you to God, and how the final act of Christ was to destroy all sin. And I want you to and the way you define that, because I think a lot of times we see the spiritual sin of us against God and trying to reconcile that. But the sin we have one another and the things you talked about, laws and all these other things, he died for that too. Can you just, before we take a break, talk about how important it is for us to understand the totality of what the Christian faith is supposed to be about?
Yes. And this is important. I've lost relationships having this conversation. Close relationships, because much of what we understand in America about theology is rooted in white evangelicalism. White evangelicalism has historically always been linked to white supremacy. Like the two, you can't really separate the two historically. You see you see them hand in hand. White Christian, to be at one point, to be white was synonymous with Christian. because everyone else were heathens that needed to be saved. And then to be saved meant to assimilate to whiteness. Not so much Christianity, but to a white presentation, Eurocentric American presentation of Christianity. And so there's a selective understanding of the gospel. I believe justice is the core of the gospel message. If we go back to Genesis 3, which was the original, the reason why we need a gospel is because of Genesis 3. And what happens in Genesis 3? There's a disruption of relationships. So it's not just I did something to someone else, that's the sin, or it's not just let's get someone saved, individuals saved, they can be in relationship with Christ, with God through Jesus, but it's also about communal. This vertical relationship was disrupted because they had uninterrupted fellowship prior to that. The relationship between Adam and Eve was interrupted. They were naked and unashamed in Genesis 2. They were covering themselves in front of each other in Genesis 3. And then the relationship with creation, humans and creation, was disrupted. So for me, we have to broaden our understanding of the gospel so that we could see that Jesus died for all of this.
All of that.
And I think that's the difference between an American presentation of Christianity and, say, an African, an Eastern, or Middle Eastern presentation. It's more communal, whereas American presentation is more individualistic.
It's my personal relationship versus I'm a part of a community, a faith community that moves forward in the things of God and the things of man in the just manner.
We image God more accurately, communally, than any one of us can do individually, even though we're all in image bearers. But even Paul's theology of the body is we are but members of a body. We are being prepared collectively to be a bride. Right now, we're betrothed. And as the Bible describes, we are collectively a bride. There's no individual person that is the bride of Christ. It's a collective. And so that's why we miss, and on these conversations about race or any type of ism, really, is because there's an individualism and then there's a communal, a collectivism.
And it's not by chance that the majority of Paul's epistles deal with relationships within the body. If you take the time to actually read it, he's talking about the relationship from brother to brother. Yep. Most of that is not for the outsiders, quote unquote. It's for those in the body.
Yep.
And so that is consistent with what you just said. Whew. Look, we're going to take a quick break. That may get a little bit heavy for some people. Let that digest for a few seconds. And when we come back, we're going to just keep rolling on. We'll get into his most recent book, The Prophetic Lens, with our guest. I'm going to call him Dr. Phil Allen Jr. We'll be right back.
I receive it.
We hope you're enjoying Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Paralysis to Purpose for more updates. Also, check out David's website at davidcookspeaks.com to learn more about his mission and purchase his book, Getting Undressed, From Paralysis to Purpose.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. I'm your host, David Cooks, along with our great guest. Yeah, I did it. Dr. Phil Allen Jr. We're going to get into his book, The Prophetic Lens, The Camera and Black Moral Agency, from Martin Luther King to Darnella Frazier. Now, if you don't know who Darnella Frazier is, look that up. I'll just leave it at that because you'll know by the time we're done talking, but it's important to understand those who are significant in making a difference. I'm going to read a couple of things from your book, a couple sentences, and that will provide the backdrop for you to just dive in. You said, I am convinced of God's readiness to employ anyone who is available at a given moment to be used in prophetic ministry. And then you went on to say, prophetic ministry begins with presence. Presence, not presence you give, presence like being there. So does love. More than just physical presence, both require consciousness, seeing, and hearing others. All right. With that as the backdrop, help us understand when you're talking about prophetic ministry and why you have identified camera, the medium of our day. You went from The Birth of a Nation back in the 1900s all the way to Spike Lee. So you compared and contrast different mediums of media that were giving narratives and the importance of how the media and devices have served social justice. So with that, let's see where we go.
So I used Walter Brueggemann, theologian Walter Brueggemann's idea of prophetic ministry or definition of prophetic ministry in his book, The Prophetic Imagination. And he talks about the prophetic ministry having two tasks: to disrupt the dominant consciousness. And he's referring to the royal regime because he's using Pharaoh in Egypt versus the Israelites as a frame. To disrupt, and these are my words, dominant consciousness and offer an alternative consciousness and perspective. But also, so to criticize, I should say, to criticize and disrupt. Also to energize an alternative community along the lines of that alternative consciousness. Let me say it again. To criticize the dominant consciousness that can lull people to sleep. Like we can start to be uncritical about the dominant. This is just the way things are. It's normal. To criticize that in ways like revealing, exposing, showing some truth that will shock people in order to offer an alternative consciousness. And in doing so, energize an alternative community. So that's what set the backdrop for my understanding of prophetic ministry. What inspired me to write it was going to Sundance Film Festival. And I went with a class, I took a class, and there was a forum, and they were teaching on prophetic. They kept saying prophetic nature of these films. Because Sundance, there are a lot of films that'll never make it to the theaters because they're not as entertaining. They're actually hard films to watch. They're dealing with real issues, a lot of independent filmmakers. And so being there, I was inspired to tell my family's story by watching some of these films and documentaries. And so there was a prophetic thing that was going on because it was disrupting the dominant consciousness that I had been compliant with and sparked an alternative consciousness in me. So that ministry was working on me. And so that's my backdrop for prophetic ministry and the camera's use in that way.
Yes. So therein lies is very interesting because there's the office of the prophet, and we're talking, which is one thing, and we're talking about prophetic ministry in general now and how different things can be prophetic and what they say and what they do and what they allow you to see because it changes your mind. It changes the way you think. For those who get a little, whatever, spooky because we're talking about levels of consciousness, it's going to change how you see what. It's a perspective shift.
Yes.
That is caused. So the prophetic causes there to be a shift in how you see what you saw. And then it changes how you're going to go back into that space.
Exactly.
Okay. That's interesting because music can be prophetic. Theater can be prophetic. Preaching can be prophetic. You just have to be aware of what that means, how that impacts you, and if it's taking you to another place in a positive way to make positive change.
Yes.
Okay. So that was your impetus. You're at the Sundance and you're watching things you're like, oh man, this is having an impact. Let's talk about Darnella Frazier. because we don't have a lot of time left. But I want to introduce her to the rest of the world that may not know who she is. Let's talk about that. She is responsible for the entire world seeing George Floyd being murdered.
Yes. So remember after that, or before that video came out, Minneapolis Police Department issued a statement. Statement glossed over everything and made it look like it was a routine but unfortunate incident. There were cameras across the street on the sides of the buildings, the surveillance cameras that saw what was happening, but it didn't capture the essence of what was going on. So here you have Darnella Frazier, who did not ask to be in that situation. That's why I said prophetic begins with presence. So does love. And she demonstrated both in that instance. She was present and she refused to leave. I don't know if we would have faulted her at 18 or 19 to have to turn away because she can't take it anymore. But she remained present out of love for this Black man. And she was steadfast in recording. So think about it. She recorded a man dying in front of her. That's traumatic.
Yeah, I was going to say that's trauma in itself.
That's trauma.
Like, she will never, ever get that visual out of her head.
Ever. But she had the resiliency to record, the presence of mind, the steady hand even to record. So she captured not only George Floyd, but she also captured Derek Chauvin, which the other cameras couldn't. His eyes, his posture, his demeanor. So the proximity she had to the event was critical. And people need to understand how difficult that was. I don't know this young lady. I would love to meet her one day. I reached out to her when I wrote the book and hadn't heard back from her, but maybe one day I'll connect with her. But the resiliency to still record and document and then use her platform to project, to broadcast to the rest of the world, that altered the consciousness of a lot of people. Even many have gone back to their old way of thinking. They've faded, but there's some people that event forever changed them. And we saw the multi-ethnic movement over the course of that summer globally. That's the energizing piece. And now it's our job to sustain the energy. It may look differently. It's not going to always be protest, but we have to sustain the energy to continue moving things forward. And I believe people are doing that in various ways.
Let's talk about energy for a second. And these are terms now that are used very openly in the marketplace: energy, universe, other things. And energy is very real. God is energy.
Yes.
And you can feel his energy, all of that. How do you sustain this? In one of the books, you mentioned how this is not a quick fix. This is not an overnight thing. And it may be generations, because I'm often thinking once this generation dies off, it's going to be better. But then you get stopped by the police in New York City and the police tells you, be quiet because I can make up a crime and you'll be done. And I'm like, okay, maybe when that generation dies, how do you remain hopeful in that climate where it appears, okay, that as things change, things stay the same?
Yep.
How can you give people hope in the midst of that prophetic lens we're talking about to sustain that energy?
So let me start with this. First, I realized not too long ago, I have to want to be hopeful. And here's why I say that. I can't just always will myself to be hopeful, because there are things that happen that just discourages you. Like January 6th really discouraged me to see what happened and who was doing what they were doing and why it happened. But I'm afraid if I don't have hope, I'm afraid of who I'll become. And that's why I start with, I want to be hopeful. The other piece is it has to be communal. So my nonprofit Racial Solidarity Project purpose is to present and foster a comprehensive approach to activism. Justice and equity advocacy, education, number 2, wellness as a form of activism, number 3, and community building, number 4. So my hopefulness comes in the fact that we may not be able to change the big picture, the nation, the way we want it, but we can change spaces. We can hone in on spaces. And every time I see in certain spaces, I see change, I see movement, hear people come and share testimonies of their uncle who was racist and read my book or watched my film, or I preached years ago and a white man came up to me and said, man, I've never heard a black man preach live in person before. My father's racist, my grandfather's racist. That's all I know. But God is doing something in my heart right now after hearing you speak. Like, I have to cling to those moments and those spaces. That's what keeps me going. Yes, I would love idealistic to happen. The nation has changed and I don't think that's realistic, but what can be realistic is the sphere of influence that I do have. I create those spaces. So it has to be communal. The other part is wellness, the part that we miss. We don't see that as a form of activism. My number one ministry is my health. I think the church does a disservice when we tell people your spouse is your first ministry or your kids are your first ministries. No, your health. Because if you don't have that, you won't be available for your spouse or for your kids or for whatever calling you have. It is being well, eating well. I run, I lift, I stretch, I close my eyes and just practice breathing, slow, deep breaths, breathing. I do this research every day. Guess what? I feel stress in my body sometimes when I read statistics and history and testimonies. And so I have to push away and just breathe, talk to the Lord and breathe. Sometimes that's my prayer. Sometimes my prayer is breathing. Thank you, Lord. Every time I breathe, thank you, God. So I got to figure out ways to have wellness. Otherwise, there's no way. James Baldwin says, he who finds no rest cannot, paraphrasing, cannot sustain the battle.
You get weary and you get run down and then you get sick.
Then you get sick.
Your body that's that trauma thing you talk about is part of that wellness.
Yes.
And getting counseling, going and seeing someone. I don't know if you have one, but I'm sure you got people that you talk to.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to have that, especially in the space you work. Now, you said something that I believe in. People often ask me, how have I made it this long journey? And I just tell them, I count every win. I literally will find something that I can be grateful for that day.
Yes.
And that'll keep me going. And because what I've learned, I'm with you. If you aren't committed to being hopeful, you are inviting depression.
Yes.
Immediately.
Yes.
And the people without hope, they have despair. Yes. And despair goes into depression, and then you spiral into other things. And so you have to believe that what you're doing is worth something and that you are worth what you're doing.
Yes.
Those two things together, they will keep you going. And you know what? And sometimes you shut it down.
You play. You go, I don't care if you go out and you just toss a football around with somebody. Or for me, play is, let's go meet some friends at a coffee shop and we're laughing and cracking up the whole time. And I walk away with this. That needs to be a part of my liturgy, my personal liturgy.
Personal space, personal liturgy. I saw something the other day. We got a few more minutes. And it's the very first time I've ever seen this. And I want to get your commentary on it. I was watching the evening news. My wife and I watch the evening news every night because it's probably the least biased of all the news. It's not on the cable network. It's just regular news. And for the first time that I could ever remember, and it was just a brief snippet, and I haven't seen or heard anything since, about a white man in Utah, a white young man in Utah that was killed at a traffic stop, 12 bullets in his car, and the parents want answers. In all my years of hearing about policing issues, I often asked, where are the white videos? Where are the videos of white people? Is this not happening at all? Because when you start talking about addressing issues in this country, until it's white, until it impacts the dominant community, and that's why we talk about allies needed for justice, for social justice. I never seen this. I was like, oh my God. And they were trying to pull him out the car, and he was trying to eat his lunch, and they shot him up with 12 bullet holes in his car. What's going to be the impact of that? Did you hear about that at all?
I did. A couple of things. It doesn't happen at the rate that it happens to us. Because first of all, we're 3 to 5 times more likely to be pulled over than they are, which leads to much more likely to experience the brutality and what have you. But like drugs, like shootings in the neighborhoods and in schools, and as you said, these things don't change. America as a whole does not take it seriously until it happens to the white community. And I said this recently. I said, until we start to see those videos and those white parents enraged, when that happens, then you will see significant change, and you will see more and more people, particularly on the right, that are on board. I don't want that to happen. I'm not wishing that it happens to anyone's community, anyone's son. But unfortunately, that's the trend in this country historically. From the war on drugs in the 80s and into the 90s, crack epidemic, they're animals, that's their issue, to the opioid addiction. Now we got a health crisis because it's in the suburbs, and it's a lot of the white kids and stay-at-home moms are addicted. To the shootings in urban communities, kids can't even walk to school and come home from school without drive-by shootings over the years, over the decades. And now you got the mass shootings. Now we need gun reform, even from people on the left. Nothing was said years past, but now it has been. So unfortunately, that's just the country that we live in that we don't want to acknowledge.
And saying that is not a hateful statement.
No.
Society is confused right now that if you say anything factual that may be offensive, then you're being hateful. And all I'm saying is this, is that I was hoping, and my first thought went out to Tyrese in Memphis, to that whole thing, to his parents and family, and to this guy, I don't know his name, in Utah, so that we now had non-racial events that dealt with policing. We had all black officers killing a black young man, and we had a white young man killed by white officers. So now the issue here, which has been what I think people have been trying to have dialogue about, is policing. Excessive force, how policing is done. So here we have now 2 non-racially driven events that clearly give us a lens to look at this issue through. And I just wonder if somebody out here who has the power, who helps manage the media, can put these things together and start the dialogue that African Americans have wanted for since I remember as a little kid when I was walking then and running from the park. Oh, the police are coming because you didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And I saw that, and and like I said, I'm with you. I don't want that to happen to any other community either. But I was like, maybe this will be it. Maybe this will bring some national attention in a different way. But I don't know. You probably see videos that I never see.
It has to happen. It has to start happening more often. Again, I grieve both. And I can say that with all sincerity. When I can see a little white kid on Make-A-Wish that's ill and can't play Little League football anymore, and his favorite athlete comes, and I'm in here by myself. I'm in tears. That's just how I'm wired. So I grieve both. But unfortunately, if it happens more often and we start to see more videos, I've seen a couple more videos, then you're going to see even more families enraged about policing. So that's the unfortunate reality that we live in, that it still is tied to white supremacy. Because what we got to realize is even during slavery, poor whites suffered at the hands of the wealthy class as well. It's just that they had a baseline. They weren't perpetually enslaved. They had membership into whiteness. They could be citizens. They had these privileges that came with their whiteness. But if we're looking at a hierarchy, they were below and treated as such. So this doesn't surprise me that you will see that, especially in poor white communities, you'll start to see that. But it's when it happens in the wealthier communities is when you'll start to see outrage.
So now look, I don't want to end on that note, but I wanted to bring it up because I thought about it when I was researching you and getting ready for the podcast. And I'm like, man, that's the first one I've ever seen ever on a television, on TV. And I was like, and I used to always wonder, where are those? And why aren't they being shown? And why aren't they being shown if people really want to have, if some of the allies really want to have this conversation? I want to, before we go, I always ask my podcast guests for their reaction to 3 words: perspective, perseverance, and partnerships. Before I do that, I want you to talk a little bit about why mentoring is so important to you. I want the audience to know that you haven't always been a doctoral candidate. You almost quit everything. And I want you to tell our audience why mentorship is so important to you and why you should not give up.
I've had coaches all my life. I've had people guide me throughout my life. But until I had a mentor to walk with me, because the key thing about mentorship is the relational aspect is someone who knows you in ways that other people don't. Someone who will speak life into you when you can't see it in yourself. Someone who will hold you accountable and call the ugly out of you when you don't want to acknowledge that part. So that for me, that's what was critical, because there was a point in time when I just felt like, is this all life is going to be for me? I've been homeless for a short little stint, almost homeless another time when I moved out here to California. Having someone who believes in you, because like you said, when we were on a break, you said, yes, you believe. Faith is what you do. But you still have them conversations with the Lord. Like, okay, God, because we're human. But guess what? When you got someone they don't have the emotions you have in that moment, who can speak into you, who can remind you of who you are, needing that perspective, that reminder, that was gold for me.
I want to read this last thing, and then we'll go through our three words. Then I'll give you the final say, a final word of hope when we leave. It says here that the camera compels us to choose a side. Either a person, community, or organization is complicit with the violence of power structures, or they are resistant to it. The prophetic lens erases the middle ground and forces us to choose whether we are for or against, as there is no safe, neutral position. The camera is not necessarily a religious instrument, but its purpose, content, and publication of the content in the hands of conscious individuals exposing injustice make it a prophetic tool. So when we talk about today, we talked about the importance of the prophetic lens, and all of this conversation today begs us to ask the question, which side are you going to be on? Are you on the side of justice, or are you on the side of injustice? Are you on the side of oppression, or are you on the side of freedom? It's a very clear thing that the camera has given us. It gives us a choice to make. And so for that, Dr. Allen Jr., I want to thank you for your books and for taking the time and being brave enough to write that. You're in a theological doctoral program. That's a risk to put this out there. People may not understand that, but I do. Yeah. And I appreciate you doing that. Now, when you hear, you already talked about partnerships a little bit, but we'll come back to that. When you hear the word perspective, what comes to mind to you?
Memory. I remember where I've been. I remember all that God has gotten me through. I remember the affirmations. I remember the suffering. I remember the joy. And that shapes my perspective. I remember seeing my father do things to my mom physically. And yet I was still expected to go to school the next day and make straight A's while I'm worried about my younger sisters. I remember what it's like to be in an apartment with no electricity, dark, cold. And yet maybe a year later, I'm in another space. So remembering, I don't dwell in the past, but I reminisce. And it forces me to have this gratitude. And I call it grace. It's the grace of God that I can remember all that God has done. I don't take those times lightly. And I tell people, when people say, how do you go through this? I'm built for this. I don't say that arrogantly. I say that that's grace. God's hand has been on me. So perspective for me starts with memory.
Perseverance.
Perseverance. The first thing I think about is being an athlete. I'm not saying this is always healthy, but I don't remember ever playing healthy. I've always played through injury or played hurt. That's not always healthy because you can compound the injury. But being an athlete teaches you to anticipate opposition, to anticipate difficult times, difficult seasons. You might lose 2 or 3 straight. It teaches you to anticipate these things and prepare for them. Decide that they're going to be what they are, but I'm going to be who I am too. And so I think sports played such a big role in teaching me how to push through, how to persevere, how to never quit. The last 5 minutes of the game was my 5 minutes. I don't care what I did the first 35 minutes of the game. Those last 5 minutes, you're going to have something on your hands. But with that, community. I'm not here without friends, family, mentors, people to walk with me. I'm not here. We cannot do this thing alone. So perseverance for me, sports taught me that, but sports is in the context of teamwork. And so I wish people would get that we would be more collaborative, that we would be more communal, that we would think more us than me so that we can press on. Otherwise, you're going to be carrying burdens that you weren't meant to carry by yourself.
I was thinking in the context of what we talked about earlier and how you find a way to process trauma and live and keep living and keep living and keep living. And I thought about that when you begin to talk about how you played through pain, played injured. Wasn't the healthiest thing to do, but it was what the moment needed in order for you to compete. And you just did that.
For the people who aren't built like that, because everyone's not built like you and I, and not that we're some superheroes, but we're just built The people who are built a certain way, but that's why the community piece comes in.
Yeah. And that leads to partnerships. The final word that,
Yes.
and you've already touched on it, but go ahead and just, that'll be the final piece of the 3-word analysis and why partnerships are important, because I love what you said, and people who've heard me speak and everything else say, I am here because of all the people that aren't here. You don't even see them. You don't know them. They have helped me learn how to get dressed. They learned to help me drive. They learned how to help me do all kinds of things that they're not here, but they're with me, but you can't see them.
Yeah.
I love the fact that you don't have to go from paralysis to finding purpose alone.
By yourself.
That there's help along the way. So go ahead on partnerships.
I'll end with this. Jesus told Peter, before he said, now because Peter was getting ready to betray him, Peter didn't even know he was going to betray him yet, but he was getting ready to. And Jesus knew that. He had the foresight to know that. And he said, now when you turn, when you repent, when you get it together, go back and strengthen your brothers. That's it for me. That's a life verse for me.
This has been a remarkable conversation. There's so much in his books. I encourage you to get Open Wounds, get the Prophetic Lens. You will not be disappointed. Have an open mind when you open those books. Forget what you know. Unlearn what you learn, and you will find yourself in a better place. How do they get a hold of you if people want to follow you? What's the best way for people to reach out to you?
I'm on Instagram and Facebook the most. Instagram is Phil Allen Jr. at Phil Allen Jr. IG. Facebook is, I have at Phil Allen Jr. There's an author page, but my personal page is where I spend the most time. And then my website is philallenjr.com. Twitter is Phil Allen Jr. too. I just don't spend much time on Twitter.
His website's amazing. You can find everything you need on the website. Thank you for being here today, Phil. Hopefully we said something that will encourage people. I want you to just say one last thing to the people. If this is the last thing on earth you get to say right now, what would you say?
Oof. It's big. The first thing that comes to mind is if we're dealing with faith, I have to say real simply, Jesus is real. God is real. If we're talking beyond faith and just some practical, what do you want your grandkids to remember? When your grandkids ask you, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Granddad, what did you do back then what would you say to them? What would you be able to say? How do you want them to remember you? What side were you on, the work that you did, who you stood for, who you stood with? I often think about that. I'm driven by my ancestors. I'm driven by those who come after me. I want those who come after me to be able to say, Uncle Phil did. Oh man, my uncle, my dad, if I were to have kids one day, my dad. So that's what I want to leave people with, more of a question than a statement. What would they say about you? What would you say to them if they ask you, where were you when? What did you do when this happened?
Again, thank you, Phil, for being here today. This is fantastic. Until next time, on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, I'm David Cooks, reminding you that your ability to endure is always greater than your willingness to endure.
You can do anything you put your mind to.
Thanks for tuning in to Paralysis to Purpose. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Paralysis to Purpose on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. To purchase his book, visit davidcookspeaks.com. Be sure to tune in next time for more inspiring conversations with David Cooks.
She grabbed me as I was walking out of class and looked me eye to eye. She says, look, you're a smart kid. What are you going to do? She just asked, what are you going to do? And I'm like, what do you mean what I'm going to do? Don't tell me what to do. I'll do what I want to do. And man, she walked away from me that moment. And I literally had a bubble come out of my head like the cartoons. And it was a picture of me in that jail, in that prison,
Next time on Paralysis to Purpose.
I am so excited to have Phil Allen Jr. here with us.
I said, that's it. Transfer to an all-boys Jesuit high school and said, I'm focusing on education. Education is going to be my new quote-unquote hustle and get out of this whole crime business. And that was a life-changing moment.
Paralysis to purpose.